I think that by now there's nothing like a civil society and civic engagement in Russia. Those who are active for civil society are dissidents. End of the quote. So this is maybe one of the guiding questions for tonight. Is there anything left of a civil society, of a critical civil society? What is the situation of these civil society members? And what effects does the permanent repression, the permanent pressure on civil society by the Russian authorities have on that, on liberals, on media, etc.? There is no doubt that democracy, rule of law, and human rights are under pressure in human rights, and the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Russia and Ukraine worsened the situation. There seems to be no holding back for the Kremlin now. Think of the shutdown of Novaya Gazeta, one of the last few independent media outlets. Think of the dissolution of Memorial. This dissolution of Memorial already began last December, but still, in the last few years, in the last few months, there was a further increase of the repression. And another contributing factor to the downward spiral is that almost all ties between West and Russia have been suspended. There are almost no cultural exchanges anymore. Little or almost no contact between universities, no school exchanges, etc. And there's another element. You know that Russia was suspended or later expelled from the Council of Europe. And if you remind that tens of thousands cases of Russians were dealt by the European Court of Human Rights in the last few years, and now this has to be stopped. For Russians, there's no, they can't go to the European Court of Human Rights anymore. So, by this I set the tone a bit for tonight's discussion. I'm very pleased that we have three experts from Russia here, but three speakers who don't live anymore in Russia: Olga Gushchina, Yudin, and Elena Lipilina. Thank you that you are here. And also a big thanks to Stephanie Fenkart and her team at the International Institute for Peace. It's always a pleasure to cooperate with you. Thank you very much. And before handing over to you, Stephanie, I would like to thank also my colleagues here at the Karl-Renner-Institut who helped me to organize this event, Silvia Rauscher and Raul Fakin. Thank you. Now, Stephanie, the floor is yours. I wish you all a fruitful debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerhard. The pleasure, of course, is also all mine, so it's always nice that we can do this together, because we need to join forces, and especially tonight when we talk about civil society and also the situation of Russian civil society in times of war. I will be moderating, and I will give the floor to each speaker for their short introductions and short interventions, but afterwards I would highly like also for you to engage and to ask questions, just to get to grasp what is going on and how you can support, or what is actually in essence, what is this about? I will start first with Greg Yudin. He's professor of political philosophy at the Moscow School of Social and Economic Sciences, and he's also a visiting research scholar at Princeton University. So, Greg, it's a pleasure to have you here again, and I hope that you manage to come in the future more often and even frequently. But Greg, I think Gerhard already mentioned some things about Russian civil society, and I think when we talk about Russian civil society, there was like a little bit of, I would say, in the period of the 90s, there was like relative freedom when it comes to the emergence of civil society actors in Russia at that time. Now we see more and more like more a full repression. I mean, we remember in 2012 it was introduced this foreign agent law, and we could see at that time already that Putin has been, and Putin's Kremlin, that they have been attacking civil society more and more, and it got more difficult for specific sectors of civil society. My question for you would be now, if you just could give us like a little bit of an overview, how is actually Russian civil society organized? What does this mean when it comes to political activism? Is it still possible to be political active? Can you actually change something when you talk about civil society these days? So what would be your grasp on whole political situation, about also the values when it comes to Russian society? Are they, because we hear so often that the societies more or less have been dealt with this, let's call it the social contract, meaning, okay, we understand that we cannot enjoy all the freedoms and we leave you alone, but we can actually live our everyday life. And I would say this changed, especially since the mobilization recently, and now it is very difficult. I mean, the war is now also, it comes into the homes of the people. So how would you say it changed the whole atmosphere when it comes to civil society in Russia, especially since the mobilization and also the war started in February?
Yeah, thank you. Many thanks to Karl-Renner-Institut for organizing this discussion, and I'm always happy to be in Vienna, always happy to be here. Well, I'm doing political theory, as Stephanie mentioned, and I'm actually doing it in Moscow, so I never left it. I mean, I've been traveling a lot, and I keep doing that. So let me introduce a couple of theoretical terms just to make it easier to understand what I'm trying to say. Well, the idea of civil society, of course, comes from a very specific intellectual tradition, namely a liberal one. And the idea behind this concept is the juxtaposition of the state and civil society, so as to leave for civil society sort of room for communication, public communication, that would, to a certain extent, at least curtail the state or limit the state and create an area for independent action. The idea of civil society and the concept of civil society gained considerable traction in Russia in the 90s with the liberal reforms. And we saw a rise of NGOs, which are interestingly called in Russia NKO, which is non-commercial organizations, and that actually tells a lot about how the whole thing is framed in Russia. Well. It was exactly in the 90s, but mostly after the 2012, that it became relatively clear that civil society is imagined by the state as a strictly apolitical domain, which kind of contradicts the initial concept of civil society, because, as we know from Habermas, for instance, that civil society actually has a lot of potential for political reforms, and it often happens so that free communication and public speech, development of public sphere, precedes some political reforms, and this is a technology for limiting, for restraining the state, and later for attaining some political aims. with this new image of civil society, it almost became a demand for it to become completely depoliticized. Interestingly, it was at this point that where so many organizations flourishing that would accept this label of NKO and start working in an apolitical way, but still promoting some sort of solidarity between the people. And what they discovered very soon was that any kind of activity like that, if it is successful enough, very quickly turns them, guess what, political. Because actually there is no basic definition of what is political and what is not political. Every time you gather people, you engage them in collective action, even if it's like caring about dogs. It has some potential of becoming political. Either it develops its own political agenda, as it happens, for instance, with associations of cyclists in Moscow, who at some point started making the political demands, and they were immediately disbanded after that. Or even if it abstains from doing that, it still contains some potential for future political action when there is a necessity. So when there is some sort of political shock, people start looking around, thinking of who could they organize with, and they immediately come across their peers in these organizations. So that started a long and I think not very productive discussion within Russia, whether it makes sense to stick to the law. Because the law is the issue here, of course. The law tells that these organizations are basically forbidden to engage in political activities. Some of them would accept that, believing that kind of raising this solidarity from below would, in the end, have some transformative effect on the system. So they would strictly adhere to the law and admit that they are apolitical. Some of them would do it, how was it, a tactical move, but many of them would do it wholeheartedly, and it was always a case with Russian activists that when some sort of protest starts happening, you immediately see people saying, no, we're not, it's not about politics. It's not about politics, we don't want you politicians here, we just want to get our things solved. And then you have a different group who was suspecting from the very beginning that that's not going to help, it's not a working strategy, that the situation will deteriorate, and if you abstain from political intervention, you actually help your opponent pressing you further. Well, as far as I'm concerned, I think the events of 2022 settled the whole argument. The second party won, I guess. It was probably a mistake to count on these civil society initiatives as a transformative potential, and renouncing the political action, hoping that some sort of opportunity might emerge later. So now I think it is first not very helpful to think of civil society in Russia, and second, not really adequate to the realities on the ground because of what we've been witnessing even before 2022, and now in hindsight we understand it was a preparation to the war. So for instance, the close down of Memorial now we understand was definitely part of the preparation for the war, because Memorial is one of those apolitical or seemingly apolitical organizations who were able to gather a lot of people, and of course their Nobel Prize is well deserved. I mean, they did a terrific job that will definitely pay out in the future. But they were gathering people around those public memories of mainly of repressions, but not only of the repressions, also of the World War II, for instance. And at the same time, they were kind of helping the political organization. And all those organizations that were capable of any kind of action were shut down well before the war. And now with the war, well, what kind of attributes of civil society do you have there? Do you have any sort of public discussion? I mean, some of the military bloggers are discussing with other military bloggers, how do we destroy Ukrainians? Oh, that's a public discussion. You can call it civil society, perhaps. Otherwise, no. Even minor concerns, and as we are moving further into this martial law, which I guess is very likely to be expanded, I mean, even those minor discussions become outlawed. Well, basically, you have no conditions for civil society, and I think a different concept, and I'll stop at that. A different concept that might be more helpful here to think of this, opposite force, this force that could oppose the state, is the concept of resistance. It is no longer time of civil society, I guess, but it's time of resistance, and I think it pays tribute to this sort of regime that we are facing in Russia right now, but also it does justice to this failed strategy of building some sort of civil society. Even though some people still nurture these hopes in Russia, significantly less of them, but I think history showed they were wrong. So it's time for resistance.
Thank you very much, Greg. And I think this already leads me to you, Olga Gushchina. She is a guest researcher at the Institute of Political Science in Hagen University. And after, it was just quite critical what Greg has been saying, and Memorial was mentioned. It just was granted a Nobel Peace Prize. But then we also know that, press freedom and media freedom is, I would say, not even nowadays existing in Russia. And the same is also true when it comes to social media. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, like all of those channels are quite either forbidden or restricted. After what Greg just said, that it's very, very difficult, like in this super narrow space, like, do you think that there is still some room for civil society? And then maybe, since you also deal a lot with democracy, maybe you can also share your idea. What does democracy actually mean for Russian society? Because I think this is also a very, very difficult notion when it comes to the essence of democracy, which is of course more than elections, fair and free elections. But please, of course, also feel free to react to what Greg has been saying. So the floor is yours.
Thank you much, and thank you much for this opportunity to speak here about the situation in Russian civil society. I would just say Russian society, because civil society, it's a really tiny part of a Russian society, and it happens so that I have a great and huge experience of, so to say, participatory observation in St. Petersburg, because I was not only a political scientist there, but I was also a part of regional opposition, and I know personally many civic projects, political projects, and all these people who are facing now the repressions in Russia. Many of them are coming from St. Petersburg, and many of them are my friends, and it's really a very sensitive topic for us. And let me say a few words just about the general concept of democracy that we are seeing in Russia now. And it is understood in Russia, in generally, we are not speaking about the intellectuals or activists, but in general it is understood in a very simplistic way. So democracy for Russian is the power of the majority. And that's why the regime has been, for the years, constructing this image of majority, or the absolute majority that supports a Russian president, Russian government. So what could we observe? Falsified elections, even the presidential one, and we are quite sure that in these circumstances, when we have completely absence of opposition in it's completely forbidden for real opposition to participate in the elections. Could Mr. Putin win elections without falsification? Yes, of course. But, for example, 53% is not enough to create this image of absolute support. That's why they need to falsify election and to show that there was a huge turnout and the support is around 70%. That's why they are publishing various opinion polls that are conducted in very special conditions. I don't want to go to domain of Professor Yudin speaking more about sociology. Anyhow, we see that all these notions about support for various actions and decisions of Russian government, Russian president are around 70-80%. So it's kind of magic numbers that need to show the Russian society that there is an absolute support of Russian politics inside the country. And also, what do they have? They have lots of NGOs that are dependent on budget funding, and that's why they should demonstrate their loyalty in order to keep on doing the good things they intended to do. And yes, they think that their concept of small good actions, they can change something in the country, but on their official and public level, they should demonstrate loyalty to the government. And we see also lots of letters in support of the special military operations. And we see, of course, the work of troll fabrics that are producing thousands of comments in social media, creating the picture that everyone and the absolute majority is supporting a Russian president and supporting Putin's regime. And so this is a picture of absolute majority is in line with the politics of the president, and vice versa. President follows the will of Russian people, and that's why it is fine. It is this kind of sovereign democracy. And this concept lays in the ground of the processes that we see in Russia. So this is their kind of democracy, how they understand that, and many people who are not so sophisticated in the issues of politics and social sciences. And we know that we had a huge problem with the education and actually it's the issue of political culture. And that's why, yes, there are many people who are in line with this kind of situation, and they can consider that what happens in Russia is like democracy. And so it's kind of a vicious circle. And when we speak about the mass media and about journalists in Russia, there is a huge problem in this sphere because those independent journalists who couldn't leave country with their media outlets like Novaya Gazeta or Meduza or TV Rain or Dozhd, so they have to start their own small media projects, and they are struggling to find some funding to lead their projects, and they are struggling to have an access to audience, because actually if a person in Russia wants to have some kind of alternative information, it's not that like impossible. There is Telegram. So Telegram channels are extremely popular among those who is looking for some alternative news in Russia. There is YouTube, and it's also like going very popular, and many Russians know how to use VPN in order to access blocked websites and social media. So it's not a huge problem in these terms. But there is a problem that we go back to political culture and the lack of media literacy and lack of political literacy. People just don't know that it's not enough to watch TV news and one should try to find an alternative perspective in order to make his own opinion. That's the issue. And it's a huge problem for the independent mass media in reaching this audience that is not so well aware about the political processes in the country. And I would say that there is a growing demand in order to find these alternative sources of information and to increase some kind of political literacy and to understand what's actually going on. And speaking about the political participation in Russia, I can add that since the beginning of this awful war, political in Russian means anti-war, because there are no such, there are no other issues that are important in the country, because we had like municipal elections in Moscow, but it was completely nonsense because it's the municipal deputies cannot change anything. And there was, like a couple of years ago, there was a hope that people who come to local politics can change the landscape. And the last success story was in St. Petersburg, in my hometown. Then in 2019, over 200 independent municipal deputies have been elected. But just in half of the year, there was announcement about the changes to the constitution, and it has already then become all clear that there will be no positive political changes in the country, and all these activities on the local level will just go in vain. What we see now, if we try to find a kind of civil society in Russia, we should like pay attention to the people who actually have been civic and political activists in Russia, and they have to leave the country. And we are observing literally an exodus from Russia, and the most active people who had absolutely wonderful civic and political projects in Russia. I can give like a couple of examples, like the director of charity organization in Russian Ночлежка. In English it will be like night shelter. It was a absolutely fantastic NGO. It was really one of the best examples of civic society organization in Russia. So he has decided to abandon the organization and to leave country because he was afraid to harm to this NGO because he has anti-war position. And it's true. So people have this choice. Either we just keep silence and keep on doing our small projects, or we leave the country and start something new. And there are lots of activists who are in Georgia, in Armenia now, in Serbia, in Turkey, and at the moment there are like 54 applications from municipal deputies are in the consideration of Foreign Office of Germany. These people are waiting for the approval of a humanitarian visa. So it means that we will have now the Russian civil society in exile. So it's the civil society that we have, and there are people who are still staying in Russia, and what do? There are actually three main options that we have to help Ukrainian refugees, and it can be also considered like quite a dangerous thing because sometimes and very often it is an evidence of anti-war position. And there are many people who are trying, for instance, to Ukrainian refugees who have been forcibly displaced from Donetsk and Lugansk region to leave Russia through Estonia and Finland. And the second thing that people can do is to help people to leave Russia and to help those who have left Russia and are staying now in some visa-free countries. And they are arranging shelters, consultations, they arranging psychological help to those who have left Russia. And the third one is to help people to spread the information about war and to spread the information about the mobilization, about the ways how to escape from the mobilization and to trying to break this wall of not understanding what's going on. So.
Thank you very much, Olga. I think you mentioned many important things. I mean, the brain drain, I think, is very important. But also what we have already been discussing today, also, Greg and me, is the situation of the support of Ukrainian refugees being in Russia, which is something we do not really hear a lot here in Austria. And I'm pretty sure also not so much in the other Western countries. And since you also mentioned like all the media outlets, which more or less needed to shut down also because of financial reasons, because of the foreign agent law, and also because they were not really able to attract people anymore during to paywalls and all the other things. And I remember quite vividly that Dost was one of it. I saw a documentary here where they actually tackled this issue in a very prominent way. Thank you very much. And our last but definitely not least speaker is Elena Lipilina. I'm sorry for that one. She's the president of the Russian LGBTIQ Sports Federation.
In exile.
In exile, again, the third now. But maybe as you just heard, I mean, Greg was saying it's very difficult actually talking even about civil society. Is it even still existing? I wouldn't even say so. And then Olga was also saying similar things, how difficult it is, and they are very narrow. And then we also do know that, of course, a war always goes hand in hand with a decline in human rights and a decline of liberal freedoms and all the other issues which are coming there. Nevertheless, I mean, I would say especially the LGBTIQ scene, always has been quite under pressure in Russia. But then again, Russia is a huge country and there are many different regions, and I know for sure that, for example, in Chechnya it's even worse than, for example, I'm guessing in St. Petersburg. Chechnya, I mean, a lot of Muslim population, with Kadyrov being the leader of the country, where many LGBTIQ people are tortured and even murdered, and it's difficult and also to get them out of the country. And this is also, so my question would be, from your experience, I mean, how do you see the situation, especially from your civil society community, which is very important? And then again, I mean, with also this new introduction of visa restrictions, I mean, I guess it's very important, especially for people from civil society, to get to support and also to get out of the country, and also to have, like, I don't know, like a link to other countries. And is this still there? And how would you assess the situation? And did it worsen a lot since the war? And was there, even if at all, any progress before that?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me here. To answer it step by step, it didn't even start in 2014 when the law on gay propaganda was adopted. It actually started in 2006 when the regions were given authority to decide on gay propaganda, and a couple of regions were not even including Chechnya. It was St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Ryazan for some reason, and a couple of others, Nizhny Novgorod. So the process started long before, you know, it reached some sort of a conclusion in 2014 with the law on gay propaganda for the minors, and that was an important point. And for the civil society, or the lack of whereof, that was a case in point that, okay, you know, it's for the minors, maybe it's not that bad, you know, it's not an omen of something worse to come. We're not yet Gilead, we're not yet Afghanistan or Iran, but we are, you know, we can manage, we can make it happen, and, you know, maybe we slap the +18 only entrance on our, you know, on our events, and that's not going to happen to us. But the problem with this is that the Russian government creates an intentionally porous legal framework. So within that framework, basically you need to pay attention to whatever is targeted. And if it says LGBTIQ, it targets LGBTIQ. It doesn't matter what follows after that. The words propaganda, minors, it doesn't even matter. You know, what matters is you are under pressure. You're the target of this. So this is exactly what happened. You know, my organization, following what Professor Yudin said, was one of those NGOs that chose the you know, the path of not saying we're doing political things. We had lots of discussions within our board on whether, you know, sport is political or apolitical, and we are to date the only still registered LGBTIQ organization in Russia, the only one still standing. I don't know for how long. I don't think for long. You know, we haven't been slapped with a foreign agents label yet, because, you know, sport is something beyond the radars. We've been having our organization, our events that are, again, flying under some sort of a radar. Not really, because, you know, we've been denied, you know, venues. We had police raids coming in. We had participants being attacked. So all those things, you know, they started happening, and they were escalating. So the thing is, as soon as, you know, this law in 2014 was adopted, no one was safe anymore, and that was an omen of something worse to come. And you're right about that. You know, it's the suppression on civil liberties that start with LGBTIQ. LGBTIQ was always the contentious topic within the Russian society, and again, following what you know, Professor Gushchina said, it always was presented as the will of the majority. You know, we, the Russian people, hate the gays. You know. You know, and the only true marriage is between a man and a woman. And this is the rhetoric that is being now repeated. And the scary development for everyone now happened yesterday. There was a public discussion of the gay propaganda, no minors, just total ban on gay propaganda. LGBT homosexual propaganda, but it doesn't change the content. The whole discussion was a full-on travesty. You know, the sort of arguments given there ranged from, you know, Spider-Man and Peppa the Pig. I mean, seriously, these are representatives of the state that are mentioning these sort of arguments as, you know, people needing protection from those kind of displays of homosexual behavior. These kind of arguments lead to an eventual, you know, acceptance of this law. So lots of lots of organizations that are already abroad, again, trying to address the second part of the question. Most of the LGBTIQ organizations have already fled the country. They were a part of this exodus. They are trying to help from beyond the grave, beyond the borders. But the problem is this: they cannot access the funds. Either way. So whenever an LGBTIQ organization that fled to, let's say, Lithuania, we know those, lots of them are settled down in Vilnius, for example, they cannot have any project that would impact the community in Russia, that would help other activists flee because of the funds. There is no way they can access it. There was no way they can wire it. There is no way they can help. And also the visas, because for a long time the Schengen visa was not it was not a privilege. It was something that you needed to have in a passport to flee the country quickly. I mean, lots of people who, knew the risks had it. They always had a valid passport. They always had a Schengen visa. It was, for many people, not a luxury, of seeing Paris. It was actually the way to get through the border quickly and outside the country. And, now with the borders literally being shut down, lots of people are feeling very, depressed is not the word that covers it, but they're feeling lost and they're feeling isolated from the rest of the world, and that's the feeling that is quite mutual. So they're isolated within the country. The government says, we don't want you, and they're isolated from the outer world because the outer world says, oh, you're Russians first of all. It doesn't matter if you're the LGBT, you're the Russians. And I've had these cases as a representative. I'm a board member of the European Gay and Lesbian Sports Federation, and there were some talks at the level of Eurogames, which is the annual sports event for the LGBTIQ, that they should not have the Russian LGBTIQ at the event because they are Russian. And there was no discussion at that point that we had to raise it, of course, because I was like, how? Of course, again, like LGBTIQ is not, a homogeneous class. Of course, there can be different views within that class. It doesn't automatically mean, the person who's LGBTIQ is anti-war. I cannot say that. I won't vouch for that. But the percentage, is marginal, and you shouldn't really exclude someone who's LGBTIQ and is the same oppressed class from being able to access safety. And this is something that's happening right now. People are being denied safe spaces just on the basis of being Russians, and I don't think that's the way to go. I think it's very discouraging for the civil society, the advocacy organizations. Not using the word that Professor Yudin kind of avoids, but for the advocacy organizations, it makes it increasingly hard because they have to bear the brunt of being Russians first and foremost, and then being something, anti-war, LGBTIQ, trying to do some good. They have to deal with this label first, and they have to deal with that immediate knee-jerk reaction when you say, "Where do you come from?" And they're like, it's really important. It's very detrimental to the whole situation. So. The problem is that there is willingness to help, especially now that the advocacy organizations are in safe spaces. The Russian LGBT community is not, and more than ever. Of course, again, since the discussions were kind of a farce, they lack public support, because that's the straw that the government seems to be grasping, and it's on one level. On another level, it's just I would say it's a programmatic statement. LGBTIQ is something from the West, and the West is sodomic and corrupt. So it's like, it's the evil West that is pushing those values that we do not accept. So LGBTIQ are part of the evil West package that is now being targeted. There is no public support, because the public is now really there are bigger things to do for the public right now. Also to flee, also to get away from the martial law and the forced mobilization. So there is no basis for that. But it is programmatic, and it is going to get worse. It is going to be implemented randomly or with aim. But it's something that's been long coming, and we're now all facing that. Gilead of state. I use that term deliberately because it's not an imaginary state. It's actually right there in Russia right now. I mean, call it a failed state or whatever state, but it's pretty much it's pretty much true, and it is going to be non-men and non-women, because I mean the amendments to the Constitution also made it possible. The amendments that only a man and a woman can be married under the side of law. That's enshrined in the Constitution. So this current law is a direct attack on the community. Again, like what can be done is access to safety, whatever that safety means for lots of people, be it the access to funds to help those, or be it the access to the safer countries and expedited visa processes. But there needs to be safety, because now it's I'm using harsh words. It's a catastrophe for everyone, including the LGBTIQ.
Thank you so much. I was going to ask you what we can do, what the West can do, actually. So you already more or less answered it, but thank you so much. But before I go into the audience, I would also like to give the same question also to you, Greg. I mean, what could the West in general do? But before you answer that question, since you also brought it up, is about this polling situation, because we in the West, we have been hearing since the beginning of the war. And when I say the beginning of the war, I mean now, unfortunately, 24th of February, we know it already started in 2014, but I mean, since February 24th, we've been hearing that the Russians are in favor of the war, or that they are supporting it, and that like all of Russians are like this. And we know that Poles, especially in a very repressive surrounding, it's very difficult to grasp like what lies behind it. So since you're a sociologist, I would like to take the opportunity also that you can explain us just a little bit what can we take out of it about this polling, and what the difficulty is with polling, especially when it comes to the situation we are now in. And please also tackle the question what the West could do to support, I don't know, this resistance movement or anything like you said, or I don't know, like to grasp the responsibility, since you say civil society is not really what is now there, what we can support in this sense, but I don't know, a feeling of responsibility is still also there and should be also supported, I would say, also in Russian society, which might be apolitical. Maybe it's different than for the younger generation, than for the older ones. And please, just very briefly.
Yeah, thank you. Well, basically, but you, Stephanie, I think you prefigured the answer. So the main thing we have to understand about Russian society is that it's a completely politicized society. So people not only have no interest in politics, very much disenchanted about politics, but also perceive it as, dangerous, but dangerous is not a thing. It's idiotic. Like if you're interested in politics, you're stupid. Business people wouldn't run anything together with someone who's interested in politics. It's like you are so naive that you don't understand something very, very basic about how things work in the world. Never, ever has anyone engaged in politics changed anything in the world. So this is a complete depoliticization, and that leads to outsourcing of political issues to the leadership, which is also not good, obviously. But, I mean, they are there anyway, and probably they know better. With all those opinion polls, this is the way they are interpreted in Russia. So let's start with the fact that the response rates in Russia are very low. They are generally low. That's not only a Russian problem, but in Russia, this has specific significance because people who would engage in responding to opinion polls, they would normally perceive it as something conducted by the state. Doesn't matter if it's true or not. This is the image of opinion polls, and so if someone is asked by the pollster to participate, well, the chances are that they will decline, and the response rates are, I mean, after the war started, say 5 to 7%. But even if they would accept it, they would interpret it as an interaction with the state on the matters which people have no expertise in. This idea of outsourcing all things political to the leadership leads to very strong sensitivity to questions like, do you support something? Because if it is perceived as a decision taken by the leader, well, yeah, of course I do support that. The leader knows better. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had this wonderful poll by Russian Field, where Russians were asked if they would support Vladimir Putin if he ends the war right now, just like it is. It was 75% for that. And then the next question, do you support Vladimir Putin if he launches a second assault on Kiev? 60% for that. That tells you everything you need to know about that. The question is not, do you support some specific policy, but do you support the president? And that's it. So 40% support whatever the president wants to do. If he wants us to fly to Mars, we're happy to do that. Particularly if I'm not involved. I mean, if somebody wants to fly everyone to Mars, let it be, but please leave me alone. So this is the message that you would normally hear from Russian people. This is bad. This is really bad, but this is a different type of disease. This is not a massive support for war, like engagement, aggression. This is indifference, complete disenchantment, nihilism. Those are very bad things, but this is a different sort of disease. And then you have, of course, you have this militarized minority, small but very vocal, that is meant to represent the Russian people. Well, they are the audience of those, of those vampires you would see on those TV shows. It's like 15 to 20% perhaps, but they are aggressive, and that's a lot. On the other hand, you have 15 or 20 or 25% of people who are opposed to the war. They are silent now because they have no opportunities to speak. And then you have everyone in the middle. So that was for the first question, but I'm happy to answer more if there are any. Now about the role of the West. Well, I think it has to do something with civil society. Look, I think all of us, but I'm speaking about my own experience. I had this experience with people from Europe, really investing a lot effort and money in building Russian civil society. And for quite a while, I was wondering what the hell they were doing. That was my problem, for instance, with the German foundations. I mean, they really did a very good job supporting many important initiatives. I was happy to cooperate with them. But looking at that, I was seeing like they're pushing really hard on developing civil society, but at the same time, on the other hand, channeling incredible money into Putin's pockets, and it was completely clear what would this money serve for. So what's the idea? Why are you doing something with one hand which is immediately destroyed by the other hand? What is the idea of financing these people who are definitely going to destroy civil society, something you are investing in? What's the logic? This was something I was not getting, but that also reflects the issue with the idea of civil society, because there was this belief in a magic effect of civil society. Well, if we invest in civil society, probably it will grow and it will change. But how? If all the money are on the side of the repressive state. So I think actually the West, the so-called West, also fell in this very trap of believing that civil society is something that automatically will help, and at the same time enabling Russian government, which was very, very clear in what it was going to do. So I think once again the whole ideology was wrong, and it's time to get over this ideology. I think that well, the lives of specific people who are suffering now, as far as I'm concerned, it is important, but it is a humanitarian issue. Supporting this civil society in exile, as you have it very, very clearly, is not a way to change the situation in Russia. That's not going to happen. It never helped. It's not going to help. But stopping to finance this government, which hasn't occurred yet, and if you're interested, I'm happy to elaborate on that. It definitely hasn't stopped yet. This is help. This is something that will help. And let me push it to the limit, and will be the final point. I mean, look, behind all that, there is this looming question. I've faced it many times. Why Russians are not protesting? Why Russians are not rebelling? So, look, there are several answers to that. But one of them is that Russians are basically dealing with the very same people who are now killing dozens of thousands of people in Ukraine. And it would be a fantasy to imagine that they would spare Russians of that fate. It requires a completely different framing. Raising civil society within Russia would change nothing about these people who are already hell-bent on killing no matter how many people. So that requires thinking of it in terms of resistance. I haven't heard of anyone suggesting delivering arms to Russians. But I'm hearing all the time delivering arms to Ukrainians, which is probably right. But in that case, like, what's the difference between the Russians and the Ukrainians? They're facing the same enemy, and that's also true of Belarusians, of course. They're facing the same enemy. So what's the expectation of facing this enemy with so different means?
Thank you very much, Greg. I think this was also a very, very blunt statement, and also the same for you. I mean, what do you think? What could the West probably do more? And also, I mean, since you are research, I mean, how do you also see like this cultural exchange or the possibility to cooperate, you know, between Russians and also the Western world? Because I feel and I see it's becoming increasingly more difficult also to cooperate even in the scientific research field or whatever. So, I mean, what would you say? Could the West do better? And please also feel free to reflect on what Greg just said and, of course, also what Olga said before.
Thank you. First, I would like to say that when we speak about what can West do, I think I completely agree with Professor Yudin that we can't help to Russian society or Russian civil society as a whole thing. There are only activists who are in danger and who should be saved somehow. And I think it's really important because we speak about people, and it's actually about the European, democratic, liberal, whatever values. And it's about the human rights. And the most, I would say, difficult and depressing thing for the activists who are still staying in Russia and who are risking their normal lives, not only their careers, like they can lose some jobs or they're choosing to work in NGOs but not to pursue some brilliant careers or whatever. People really put a lot of efforts to change something in Russia, and their core idea was to bring these Europeans to Russia. And these are the people who have been convincing their fellow citizens that Europe, the West, is not an enemy to Russia, and there is no hatred towards Russians, and there is no discrimination. And we had a huge wave of such kind of messages on mass media or in Russia that Russians are subject to discrimination. And it were the Russians, the activists inside the country and outside the country who has been confronting this idea and telling that no, there is no such kind of discrimination. And now then the borders are closed. So we have been afraid of closure of the Russian borders by Putin. We were afraid that the new Iron Curtain will fall from the Russian side, but not from the side of Finland or from the Baltic states. And unfortunately, Russia doesn't have the borders with all the countries or the Schengen agreement. And that's why there are only few points of entry to the European Union. And now we see that people who are trying to escape from Russia have this way closed. And we see the activists who have been helping those people to leave Russia and who had this hope that they can escape it if it becomes even worse. Because there are still many people who are staying in Russia and who are hoping to go through this difficult period, but not to leave their country, because it's complicated. It's very complicated. It's a big tragedy. Then a person has to leave his home country not on his own will, but because of some dangers and some threats. And then those people, those activists, see the actually national discrimination. Then people are not let into European Union and are told that it is a privilege for Russian to have the freedom of movement, and they are starting to have really big doubts about actually the European values. I've seen like dozens of such kind of messages, comments from the people who I know personally, and I have no doubts about their principles and values, and see how these people who are actually the so they have been creating a huge basement for this emergent civil society in Russia. Now they have doubts in those values. It looks for them like actually Mr. Putin was right. There are double standards in Western countries. There is discrimination in Europe against Russians, and they actually basis of their values, this core of European values and their desire to build democracy in Russia is under threat, because they see this attitude, they see real facts. I'm not speaking about some fake news spread by propaganda media. I mean first-hand stories. And I see like people are starting to think maybe we don't need these Western values if there are no true value of human life, and there is no true wish to save people irrespectively of their origin. And I think it's a huge issue that we can lose actually those few people who are still staying in Russia and who are still, to say like so naive that they still believe in democracy. Like it is the perspective they are seen inside Russia. So they are naive. They believe to good Europeans and Americans, but it's all corrupted. Now these people. Unfortunately, see some signals that yes, the European democracy can be corrupted, and it's not that ideal like they wanted to see it. And I think it's the one. It's more about some kind of moral issue they're facing. And the second. A very big issue I see, and what I think European politicians should think about. There is a quite big group of political prisoners in Russia who are literally in jail. And Russian opposition is not a party to any kind of negotiation with the Russian government. So there is no one who will represent the interests of these people. So literally they have to wait until the Putin's regime falls in jail. And I'm not speaking about Alexei Navalny or Vladimir Kara-Murza, who have made some kind of choice to stay in Russia, to come to Russia, and then to be imprisoned. But I speak about the people like Alexander Skochilenko, who has placed 4 price tags informing about the war crimes in Ukraine. in a nearby supermarket. She is in jail since the end of April. She has a genetic disease and her health is literally deteriorating because she must have special diet. And in prison it's completely impossible, and I don't know, will she actually survive this time of imprisonment? And so there is Alexei Gorinov, who has been sentenced for 7 years just for speaking up against war at the municipal council. So there are actually many people, more than 100 of persons, who have been placed into some kind of detention because of their anti-war position. And I think that when Western countries are trying to negotiate with the Russian government, and then they are considering imposing new sanctions or lifting some sanctions, probably it will be a good humanitarian step to include this list of people who are imprisoned now to some kind of deal. Because, yes, there is also the famous list of FBK, of 6,000 corrupted civil servants and oligarchs and propaganda workers and so on, who are in charge of this regime. But also there should be a list of people who one should try to save, because they're really in danger. And so they're already in absolutely awful conditions of Russian prisons, and there is no other party who can raise their voice to help them.
Thank you very much. Would you still like to add something to what Greg said or Olga said?
I mean, it's pretty full as it is, but I mean, it is on one hand a humanitarian issue when you're getting out the people who are vulnerable, but also it is a matter with LGBTIQ specifically. It is a matter of public consciousness in a way. So when we're saying the will of majority is being manipulated, it is. But the problem is that, once Putin's regime falls, and eventually it will fall, we will be dealing with the same set of heritage that this regime left. And homophobia will be one of them, because at some point, in 2014 or 2006, it doesn't really matter. At some point, it was institutionalized. This violence has been institutionalized. This homophobia has been institutionalized. And it's a huge amount of work to overthrow this part of heritage. And again, like activists who are now brought in safer spaces and people who fled could be an asset to this. I mean, not now, of course, but in some time. So letting them live and letting them be safer is actually a huge, it can have a huge impact on what, Russia will be post-Putin, because this is, I guess, what we are all waiting for in one, way or another. And this is one of the important steps. And I mean, just to add to the, this Russian kind of stigma, I was a part of the, there is an organization in Germany called Quartira. It helps specifically Russian-speaking LGBTIQ. So from whatever Russian-speaking country that is, they take everyone in. So I was a part of the workshop that specifically got together the Ukrainian LGBTIQ refugees. And there was an exercise, and everyone was saying where they were from, and I was one of the facilitators because I wanted to be part of that. And everyone was saying like, I'm from Odessa, I'm from there. And when I said I'm from Kaliningrad, everyone was like, what are you doing here? Because this division between, Ukrainians and Russians runs deep now, deeper than ever, but it's being perpetuated by the media, by, this public discourse also, in the Western countries, because, you're slapping this label and automatically whatever you stand for doesn't matter, whatever your color of the passport is matters for some reason, So, and these are the divisions, again, we will have to deal with, and it's not possible when you're not, in the space where you can breathe. So that would be, my message.
Yeah. still very far from reconciliation. So there's a huge challenge still upcoming. We do still have time for some questions. So please, who would ever like to have a question, or if possible, if it's to a specific person, say to whom it is. If not, if it's to all of them, feel free to ask. And do you want my mic?
Thank you. I have a question to Greg about the resistance you mentioned. What is your vision of this resistance? Because I hardly imagine civil society activists taking up arms and going into the revolutionary situation, but it will be more likely that the hardcore pro-war party will take over, at least at first. So how do you see the transfer from where we are now to the beautiful Russia of the future?
Oh, those are two different questions. Excuse me if I pass on the second one, just because it's a long one. As for the first one, I think it's partially true, and that's actually part of my problem with with the concept of civil society. It's a good concept. It's not a universal remedy. In situations like that, it's not going to help politically. And yeah, I think you're right to a certain extent. Like many of the people who are active within this limited civil society, they are not the people who are going to take up arms. They're different people. Look, you have some people who are now blowing up the buildings in Russia. You have those partisan wars in Belarus. Those, I mean, I really doubt that those are people who are taking money from German foundations on civil society. Those are different kind of people, and in this situation right now, politically, they probably matter more. But what the history of resistance movements tells us is that when there is a resistance movement, well, people start reconsidering. I mean, whilst there is an opportunity for doing that, I mean, people might rethink their strategy. We're no longer doing this thing, we're probably doing that thing. At least like reframing the whole thing and looking at that from the viewpoint of supporting the general resistance movement would kind of encourage people to start rethinking and to start thinking of what could be the strategies, what could be the real subversive strategies in Russia. And my estimate is that there is plenty of people who would be ready to start engaging in that once there is this opportunity. But in order to do that, we have to, resist a little bit the framing on this as a Russo-Ukrainian war. This is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. This is a war waged by a gang of people who are able to scare some part of population against three countries. And in all of these three countries, you have the same war waged a little bit with different means, but this is the same war.
There's another question over there in the back.
Thank you very much. I'd be interested to hear from Greg on the issue that you mentioned, how the West is basically still financing the Russian state. So if you can elaborate on that. And to all speakers, maybe, so when we're speaking about the remaining civil society in Russia, what are the regional differences, if you can maybe a little bit explain, apart from St. Petersburg and Moscow, what are other centers, especially further to the east? Thank you.
Who would like to begin? Do you want to begin maybe on the second question?
Yeah, on the second question. So my organization had regional presence in almost the whole, I'm saying had because it's no longer active, unfortunately, because most of the active people had to flee to various countries. But when it was active, we had like 3 centers that were mostly doing things. And that was, of course, St. Petersburg, Moscow, but also in the Urals, that was Chelyabinsk or Yekaterinburg, and also the Far East, which is Vladivostok. So there were like, 3 main centers of activism there, people being more mobile, more, like vocal about things. But of course, they faced a lot of, backlash from the government for literally anything they did. Be it a seminar, just a simple seminar, on LGBTIQ rights or anything like that, or even like a volleyball match. So we had people, masked people, storm the gym where a group of 15 were playing volleyball, so they would go to those kind of extents, and of course they didn't act to the enthusiasm of those who were running this sort of events. And also in my organization, it added to this discussion of how political we are, and how apolitical we should be to keep our participants safe. This kind of a, like, what do we do? Like, how did we get to the point? What did we say for those masked men to storm the gym? Did we say anything wrong? Did we put a rainbow flag somewhere? But in most cases, there weren't any rainbow flags. It was just an anonymous report. Somebody tipped. So for them, it was the pressure was mounting gradually, and for us, the pressure was also mounting gradually because we wanted to develop our organization, and of course, the political agenda was always political. And I agree with you here. No matter what you do, if you gather, like in Soviet times, if you gather in the group of 3, you can overthrow the government potentially in the government eyes. So that's the kind of the premise for that. Now it's hard for me to gauge on the situation because, again, like lots of people and the leaders are now in exile. But from what I'm hearing from most of them, they're waiting for that to be over in a way. They're helping the way they can right now. But again, their ways are limited. And they are still, they feel like they are taking a break before coming back and doing more. So this is the kind of optimism that I'm hearing. I don't know if it's going to be there in a while, but it's still in place. There is still hope.
Would you like to comment on that question as well?
Probably, Russia is really a very huge country, and there are different regions with its own specific. But if we speak about some kind of political engagement and any kind of civic activism, if we don't speak about Russian and St. Petersburg, where there are many universities, people who have better living conditions, and we go to the idea that the quality of life and increasing of these living standards brings people makes people to demand more political freedoms. And in these terms, of course, St. Petersburg and Moscow are not real good examples to say about the situation in Russia. And in some regions, there are some kind of local issues, like we have seen a protest in Bashkortostan. Then it was an attempt to build a plant in an area of green massif, and we have seen a local protest in Yekaterinburg. Then there was an attempt to build a church in a local park or something. There are some points of protests as an answer to some kind of local issues. And there was absolutely a deviant case of Khabarovsk, where there was completely political protest against the governor and then the head of the region, who was actually elected by the people and who could join all the efforts and to bring to the governor position a person who was not appointed from Moscow. And later that person, the governor Furgal, was arrested, and people have started to go to this protest. But I think it was the issue that it's really a very remote region, and actually, what did the local police forces do, they have just ignored it. They decided to ignore it, and the protest has been just going down because people cannot protest like every day or every week during 1 year. And that's because it was not really an important region. They have let people just go out and solve the problem by itself. And I don't see actually any bigger opportunities to raise some kind of local resistance like in national republics. We have heard a lot about the Republic of Buryatia, and because so many people from this region have been mobilized and taken part in the war in Ukraine, and it's a really big problem for this very poor region. And but poor region don't go to protests. It's the issue. And the people from rich regions are not so engaged into some kind of military activities, and we have seen that there were not so many problems with mobilization in St. Petersburg, for example. So there are no so many reasons for people to go to protest against this so important issue.
Thank you, Greg. The same question for you, but maybe adding one more component is also, I mean, we talked about the regional differences, but there are also religious differences. And maybe you can also, maybe if it is related, even if at all, the last incident, you know, at the training center when 13 people were shot in a military training camp. I mean, supposedly, allegedly by Tajik soldiers. So maybe if you can relate to that one. And then also the other question, of course, I mean, how we are still financing more or less the Putin regime. And please.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'll give you just 3 examples of that. Hope it will be enough for now. Now, well, there was a lot of talk about like Western companies pulling out of Russia. That's been hugely overestimated. The vast majority of them stayed, and what is, I think, important is the pretext under which they stayed. Basically claiming almost publicly that they don't care about the war. They care about their customers. They are loyal to their customers. They don't like the war, of course, but what they do care about is their customers. And that, in an interesting way, completely replicates the thinking of the majority of Russians, who, of course, not for the war. Everyone's against the war. Just people just caring about their own business. I mean, if we can vote for the war to be over tomorrow, okay, everybody will vote for war to be over tomorrow. But people are caring about their own business, and that's also the thinking of those companies. I don't know if you were aware of that. And yeah, and the outcomes to which it leads. So you don't know if you were aware of that, but quite recently we had this mobilization. So how do they accomplish this mobilization? They accomplish it through the employers. So the employers are legally required to assist the Russian government with drafting people. And many Western companies were doing just that. So helping the Russian government to recruit people to this war. That's just a matter of fact. Some of them would quietly disobey, like inviting the employees and telling them, well, please get out of here as fast as possible. I know those cases, but many of them would comply, basically becoming part of the mobilization machine, which is quite predictable. I mean, if you're doing that, they will, at some point, they will definitely make a part of the mobilization machine. Why not? So that was the first one. The second one, well, there was a lot of discussion about sanctions. So suddenly, now in September, after the annexation of those regions, there was discussion about the 8th package of sanctions. And finally, you have a sudden discussion of including in this package, in its 8th package of sanctions in late September, the embargo on tear gas to Russia. Like, what's the point? I mean, what's the use of tear gas? Can it be used for fighting the war in Ukraine, or what could be the use of tear gas? And honestly, I didn't follow that. I don't even know did they decide on putting this ban. And there's a lot of things like that. I mean, I can talk hours about companies like Nokia helping to fund a huge surveillance system built in Russia, in complete cognizance of what this system would be used for. And now Finland is joining NATO. What's the point? Then finally, of course, you have this big issue of energy dependence. Yeah, that's fair enough. I know that everyone's pulling out, and I'm saying it with mixed feelings because I don't want my country to be hurt. I mean, it's a big issue for not only for this government but for my country that obviously needs those business partners. But in this situation, obviously all this money will be spent on war. So everyone is pulling out, but that will still take time. And those are money which keep coming and will keep coming into the pockets of those people. So those are just 3 examples. Now, Stephanie's question about this accident. I was just mentioned it today in a previous conversation. I think it's really interesting because I don't know if you heard of the accident. So it was a shooting in a training center near the Ukrainian border, and 2 or 3 citizens of Tajikistan shot and killed 30 people, I guess, and wounded much more because the colonel or the lieutenant colonel there would call Allah a coward after some exchange. So that why this accident is very interesting is that because it shows a lot of divisions that are present in Russia, but that are normally concealed with what I call the helicopter money, which are present but not on the surface. So look, here you have first of all the issue of everyone regarding the Tajik people as the second-class people. And now even Tajik president starts telling this in Putin in his face that, well, come on, we are not the backyard workers. Half of our intelligentsia would go to Russia and get the education there, and a lot of doctors in Russia are from Tajikistan. Putin is completely oblivious of that. For him, those are people who would clean the streets. So that's number one. And number 2 is, of course, the ethnic issue, because there were not only Tajik people implicated, but also other people, and we have those tensions between various peoples brewing now. And then the religious thing, of course, because the lieutenant colonel has no idea that calling Allah a coward is not a good thing. I mean, it's not a brilliant idea. But that represents the thinking of the government. Who cares about Allah? And then, yes, and then, of course, the division between between people with various attitudes. Because in the first place, these Tajik citizens never meant to go to war against Ukraine. It makes no sense. So there are those divisions and many more. Actually, the age division is very important, and they're brewing in Russia. And, well, my prediction is that expect more of that. Because the more, the less money these people have to alleviate those problems, the more of that will surface. I'm not saying it kind of happily, because many of those issues, they might hurt the country and actually a lot of space beyond the country. But at that point, I think it's almost inevitable.
Thank you very much. So we're already coming to the end, but I saw one more question back there, I think. So maybe quickly we still have time for that one. If it's addressed to a specific person, please tell us to which, and if not.
Well, it's not addressed to a specific person. It's protesters protesters in Belgrade were shouting, "Putin is not Russia." And it came to my mind, but what if Russia were Putin? I'll explain. My mother was a diplomat, a German diplomat in Siberia, consul general. I've done a little bit of research there as well. And it's become very transparent to me that on the one hand, all of that gang, I think someone's called it, are of course part of the society. There's one society. On the other hand, they're so detached and so decadent with respect to the rest of their society that I wonder, well, what would be the right way for a future diplomacy? I'm thinking of German diplomacy, but it probably works as well for Ukraine, to address the relation with the Russian Federation, not right now, obviously, but at some point when serious negotiations will become immediately feasible. What is, in your views, what is important for that diplomacy to keep in mind about the society as such, and not just about the couple of people in the presidential palace?
Thank you very much. Would you like to address that first? Yeah.
I think that the answer on your question leaves depends on how what kind of Russian government will we have, what kind of changes will we have, and will it be like will Russia suddenly, I don't know why, become a democratic state, and will the Russian government say, yes, we condemn the aggression against Ukraine, and now we are ready to give back all the territories according to the Budapest memorandum, and we are releasing all the political prisoners and so on. It actually looks like a dream. So we are not sure that it can happen like in 10 or 20 years. Anyhow, will Russia be on the edge of falling apart because of the very grave consequences of the sanctions and the war and the situation? Then the lots of specialists have left country, and the Russian economy will be deteriorated. And there will be so many options about this. But actually, one idea is very, very important to any kind of situation, is that Russian people do need a really big time and a really big effort to build a normal political culture. And if you want to proceed some kind of relationship with a Russian state, and if we hope to have Russia like a normal, adequate country on the map of the world, we should invest into political education, into developing political culture, and you know, like in Germany after the Second World War, there was a huge program of not only denazification, but also it has taken 2 decades to for German society to accept this idea of collective responsibility and to internalize the ideas of democracy. And I'm sure that in best case, if the current proto-totalitarian regime in Russia falls and Russia has a chance to revive in a new democratic form, lots of attention should be put into building adequate political culture. And it's the only, it's the most important cornerstone, actually, for the future of the country. And otherwise, we'll have one more resurrection of autocracy, and it will go on and on this in this vicious circle of autocracy.
Would you like to add?
I mean, I second that. It really does depend on who you're talking to, you know, like what kind of government you'll be talking to and whether that government would really represent the people and what would the country look like, you know, like would it be the country of many autonomous republics or plus Moscow? We don't know. Like we don't know what's going to happen, you know, with Russia over the time. The problem, like I foresee, is that it depends, of course. You know, it depends on how history goes. But with Stalin, for example, the change didn't come immediately. Lots of people were expecting Stalin to die and the repressions to immediately ease off. It didn't happen. You know, it took a succession, I think, of 3. You know, general secretaries for, you know, the freedoms to gradually become something that people could bear, you know. So we're talking about a long process. We're talking about a very long run. And again, it really does depend on the type of thinking. Is government really people, or is people really government? So I think finding the answer to this question is also like looking into a crystal ball where you can see nothing. So I wish you know, like we can get back to this question, and I would love to answer it to you when we have more clarity than we do now. I mean, because right now all we deal with is shambles. You know, is a collapsing state, is people that are desperate, is war. So it's pretty hard to gauge something out of that picture, you know, something that would make dialogue even possible.
Well, I agree that there's a lot of contingencies, but still I would probably say 2 things that do matter. Well, look, I agree that we have this problem of who we're talking to. But let us think of how did we get here? That the only way to have an access to Russian society, as you put it, is via the government. And if you have idiots in the government, then the access is blocked. So, look, I realize there's a lot of disappointment about like integrating Russians for like 30 years, and now they are doing that. But what kind of integration was that? I mean, we're dealing with a country where more than 70% never, ever had a chance to leave the country. And only 8% of Russians have ever been in Europe. Like, what kind of integration was that? It was integration of the Russian money into European banks? Was it the integration of part of European elites into Russian boards of directors? Well, that was fine, but this is what it got us. So the aim should be, of course, the real integration, the communication between citizens. I mean, I've been doing research with the young people. And it's amazing to see how people who had just even a small experience of visiting Europe, how their thinking changes. It's not that they immediately get westernized. And I'm actually a little bit happy that people in Russia finally realize that the West is not heavens. Because it kind of encourages critical thinking. But in order to start this critical thinking, you gotta see, you gotta see some different places. Because otherwise it wouldn't work. So this, I think, is worth putting investment into. And then the second point, if I'm allowed, the second point is that, well, I think there was a big unsolved task, and it doesn't really matter who is to blame for that. So this unsolved task was to find a place for Russia in security architecture and in some sort of global project. It was never done. And those military considerations are only part of the problem. I mean, whatever government you have there, even if it's a good, like, Republican government, forgiven about those imperial ambitions, forgetting about these imperial ambitions. now, how do you exist with a whole huge military bloc on its borders, created purposefully many years ago against it? That creates tension. And, well, this tension has to have some sort of solution. I mean, Russia should be integrated into broader security architecture, and very importantly, should bear its part of responsibility for maintaining peace in the region and also beyond that. So those are the issues, and that also pertains to the energy issues, to the global green transition. So Russia has to have a place there. It's a responsibility that's on us, Russians, but also on the other partners. And without that, it would be a bit difficult.
Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you very much to the whole panel, to Olga, Elena, and Greg. I think it was excellent, and we were trying to talk about civil society, and you see like how multi-layered everything is. So we come from, you know, like human rights and democracy, and then to activists, then even like furthermore to economic cooperation, going further than even into security architecture. So everything is very much interrelated. I thank you very much. I think it was very interesting. You shared a lot with us, and I think we also could learn a lot. I at least did. So thanks again. Before I really finish, thanks again a lot, of course, to Gerhard, Marchl and the Karl-Renner-Institut who made this all possible. They are also going to invite you still for a glass of wine and some snacks, as far as I'm aware. So please feel free if you want to chat. I guess you're going to stick around for some more minutes, so you can still approach the speakers, and please also do that. So it was a pleasure for me. Enjoy the evening. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being interested in those important topics. Also looking to the different angles, because it is very difficult even, I would say, to talk at all publicly about Russia these days in Europe. And this is also part of effect, and I think it was a great event. So thanks for coming, and enjoy the fun part of the evening. Thank you.